Today we're going to be talking about World War One and the things that went on between 1914 and 1917. In the last lesson, we talked about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Remember that happened in Sarajevo in Bosnia. Remember this was also the spark that is going to start the war. After the assassination, which occurred in May of 1914, on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary would declare war on Serbia. And if you remember from the last lesson, remember this was because the assassin Gavrilo Princip was from Serbia and he was a Serbian nationalist. So therefore Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination and for eventually starting the war. Because of the alliances that were already in place, Serbia had an agreement with Russia and that Russia would help out in case of war. And so Russia begins mobilization of its forces to help out Serbia against Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary had an alliance with Germany. And of course, with this alliance, the Germans are going to actually come to the defense of Austria-Hungary, especially when Russia begins to support Serbia. Germany would declare war on Russia when this happens, and when Russia refuses to fail to stop its mobilization of its army, and mobilization just basically means to get your military forces together and get them ready and prepared for war. And so when Russia continues to mobilize and move their military, Germany goes ahead and declares war on Russia. One thing that would happen is we would see the emergence of two fronts during this war. We would have the Western Front, which would become a stalemate, and a stalemate is when neither side can gain an advantage. And then on the Eastern Front, the war would be mainly a mobile war where there was a lot going on and where the armies were able to move quite easily versus the way they were on the Western Front. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Italy, of course, we talked about how they had joined the Triple Alliance initially, but then they would join the Allies shortly after the war begins. And hopefully, what they were looking for was to get land back that Austria had taken from them. And so, by switching sides, that was their reasoning behind it. The Allies would take all the German colonies, and we talked about how they had some in Africa. And of course, it was easy for them to take these colonies because most of the Allied powers had superior navies, especially Great Britain. The other thing that was going on was once the war started, Germany was put under a naval blockade, meaning that Germany was pretty much surrounded by Allied ships to keep things from going in and going out. The plan at the beginning for the Germans, once this war started, was to use something known as the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was proposed by General von Schlieffen, who said that he believed that Germany should attack France first and then deal with Russia later. The Germans were hoping to catch the French off guard by going through Belgium and initiating this attack. And because of their movement into Belgium, Belgium was a neutral country, meaning that they didn't take sides with anyone. But the Germans went into Belgium anyway. And once they did this, that's when the British are going to declare war on Germany. Again, when Germany violates Belgium's neutrality on its advance into France, Britain would declare war on Germany also in 1914, shortly after the war begins. One thing you need to make note of here is just make sure that you know that Belgium was neutral, and this is what's going to cause Britain to enter the war. Of course, we had two groups that are going to form. The Central Powers would include Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and Italy. And of course, I just mentioned that Italy would switch sides. The Allied powers would include Russia, France, Serbia, and Great Britain once the war begins. Italy again switches side and would join with the Allies shortly after the war starts. Most of the war along the Western Front was known as trench warfare. This is what causes the war to become a stalemate on the Western Front, and it stayed that way up until 1917. A couple of common things that you guys may have learned about either in earlier classes or in this lesson from reading some things. Um, a lot of these guys dealt with something called trench foot, which was common due to damp and muddy conditions usually found in the trenches. In some cases, it could get so severe that legs and feet had to be amputated. The other problem that these guys faced living in the trenches was lice. They would get in their clothing, in their beds, making them itch, and just wasn't a very pleasant thing. And then the other thing were rats that were as big as cats that scurried around all throughout the trenches. A few other things too. No man's land was the area between the trenches of the opposing army. They called it that naturally because if you went out there, more than likely you were going to get killed because there was a sniper or either machine gun fire would take you out if you came up out of the trenches and tried to cross over this piece of land. The other term that was quite familiar in trench warfare was something known as going over the top. This basically just means going over the top of the trenches. This is when they came out of their trenches to charge or to launch an assault against an opposing army. Again, here's a diagram of the trenches, just sort of showing you how complex and laid out they were. Of course, the no man's land you see over here. It could be anywhere from 25 yards to a mile wide. You notice they put up all the barbed wire and things to try to make it difficult to cross through and get over those particular areas. Here's a picture of some World War I soldiers removing lice from their clothes. Of course, it looks like it's pretty tedious, and having to deal with it had to be, unbearable. A couple things too about World War I that made this war so deadly were the new weapons and new technology. Of course, you can see here with this chart, these are World War I deaths. You notice that there were a lot of deaths on all sides. The Triple Entente took 36% of military casualties, whereas the Central Powers only took 22%. So a lot of guys were dying on the Allied side. But the reason why a lot of deaths were occurring was mainly because of the weapons and the technology that had come about during this period. Things such as machine guns, rapid fire artillery, these huge artillery pieces could be moved out onto a field and they could launch these huge shells from miles away at each other. Grenades, of course, poisonous gas, which was a main one, which could get in your lungs, could cause your skin to burn. All sorts of bad things happen with poisonous gas. Of course, tanks were used for the first time. These the metal around these tanks allowed them to move through areas with little or no resistance. But tanks were definitely deadly during this period. Airplanes for the first time. Now they could fly over an area and really inspect it, and then they could drop bombs. And of course, you had to be pretty good to drop a bomb back then because you had to definitely be directly over your target or sort of like lead your bomb into where you wanted it to go. So pretty tough flying an airplane during this period. And then the last one, which we're going to talk in depth about, are the submarines or U-boats, mainly used by the Germans initially, but the U-boats became a very strategic weapon during World War I, especially for the German side. The U-boat was often referred to as the underwater assassin. The Germans used this new naval weapon even before World War I. They were undetectable. They could emerge at any time. Of course, they didn't have sonar during this time, which made the U-boat pretty effective. During the war, U-boats sank many Allied ships and hampered trade and military supplies for the Allies. Of course, I just told you earlier, too, that the Germans were under a naval blockade, but they couldn't keep the U-boats from being able to get out and cause havoc. The Germans practiced something called unrestricted submarine warfare, or USW. Again, a picture of the German U-boat. And we're going to talk a little more about this in just a minute as well. You'll notice the one on the left shows them actually stopping a ship, inspecting it, and we're going to talk about why they were doing that as well. A couple of ships that played major roles during the war were the Lusitania and the Sussex. The Lusitania was a passenger ship that was sunk by a German U-boat in 1915. There were 1,198 people on board the Lusitania, including 128 Americans. Many countries became outraged over the incident, especially the United States. The claim by the Germans was that the Lusitania was carrying war supplies, and therefore they had the right to sink it. And of course, this was one of the causes or one of the reasons that would eventually bring the United States into the war. Of course, this happens in 1915, but it's not until 1917 that the U.S. joins the war. The use of unrestricted submarine warfare, though, slowed down when another ship known as the Sussex was sunk. Therefore, after the Sussex was sunk, a pledge was made. This was an agreement by the Germans to stop attacking non-military ships. The Sussex, again, was a French passenger ship. This would continue up until early 1917, but eventually the Germans would break this pledge and start back sinking ships that were not military ships in 1917. And this would eventually help wake the sleeping giant, which is going to be the United States. Again, a picture of the Lusitania on the left sinking, and another picture of a damaged Sussex on the right. And that is going to do it for this lesson. Please make sure you go back and review and look over everything. Make sure you've got it all written down the way you would like. Please pause and stop this as much as you need to. Go back and listen to the things. It's really better for you to listen more so than just write the words down by listening to it, and then writing it down. That tends to help. So go back and review this. Use it as much as you need to, and we will pick up with the United States entry into the war in the next lesson.